To you, it's time for Alan Robson's Grisly Tales. You've come to expect some very strange and downright peculiar stories, and I've got some more for you, as you'd imagine. Now, imagine you could build yourself a murder castle. Sounds impossible, and yet that is exactly what a man called H. Holmes did. He was a pharmacist, yet he spent most of his early career scamming insurance companies, and then he moved to Illinois just before the 1893 Chicago World's Fair to work as a pharmacist. Now, back then, you didn't have to go to college for 5-10 years to become a pharmacist. You simply said you were a pharmacist, opened a shop, and off you went. And it was there that H. Holmes built what he would refer to as his very own murder castle. It was a 3-story inn that he transformed into a macabre torture chamber. There were all kinds of strange devices in there to hurt people, to gouge out eyes, to rip into flesh, to emasculate men, and to tear off the intimate area of a woman. Some of the rooms had peepholes so that he could stare in and watch people as they suffered. Others had gas lines in case someone was fighting back too hard. The gas would subdue them. If they should get out of the main cell, he'd built trap doors so they would fall 15 feet and break their legs and be available for his tortures again. He also had soundproofed padding, secret passages, ladders and strange hallways that would lead to dead ends, or they would lead to cells. There was also a chute that was greased with Vaseline, that should anybody be making their ultimate escape and getting close to the front door, they would shoot down the chute that would leave them in the basement, where H. Holmes had his very own surgical table, a furnace where he literally burned people alive, and an old-fashioned medieval rack, just like the ones you can hear when we make our visits to Chillingham Castle. On robsonsworld.com, there's a whole host of stories where you can hear about what happened there, quite eye-openers they are too. But back to H. Holmes. Before and during the World's Fair, Holmes brought back a lot of different victims, nearly always young women, to his lair, where he would put them in that room, turn the gas on, and then after they were poisoned, whether they were alive or whether they were just giddy, he would take them to his basement, where he would carry out the most horrific and devastating experiments. Then he would dispose of the bodies. The furnace was perfect for that. Or alternatively, and can you believe this, he would skin the bodies, put the flesh into the furnace, and then sell the skeletons to medical schools. To this day, we believe that medical schools all over the United States have innocent people, the bodies, or the skeletons, of murder victims that they're educating their students with right now. Now, all while this was going on, because that frankly was just his hobby, he was working various insurance scams, collecting money from insurance companies, and he was finally caught when one of his co-conspirators, someone he was using to claim money, tipped off the police when Holmes decided he wasn't going to pay the guy quite as much as he'd promised, and he was eventually convicted because the police then got a search warrant for his house and found all of this murder castle. And he was eventually convicted of the murders of 4 people. But just before he was hanged in 1896, and it was one of those hangings where the rope was a new rope rather than an old rope, therefore it was very sharp. And when he was hanged, they said that his head clung to the body, just being held on by one thread of flesh. But just before he died, he said, "Killing 4 people? I killed at least 27. Have they not found them yet?" Well, of course, they never did, because their skeletons were in various universities and doctors' offices, and their flesh had been burnt to a cinder, burnt to ash in that furnace. And he's just the first subject of tonight's Grisly Tales. Now, I'm sure that most of you will have heard of our next subject. A very handsome chap. In fact, they've just made a recent Netflix all about Ted Bundy. Now, he was well educated. He was, in fact, a charming man. And he seemed, even to the police, to be one of the most unlikely of serial killers. And that, of course, was his trick. And he ended up committing 10 years, a multi-state killing spree. And even though he's a mass murderer, a lot of women believed he was one of the most handsome men of the time, and all the way through his trial was sending him love letters and offers of marriage and money and a place to live and solicitorial help to help him avoid being executed. Well, he was born to an unmarried teenage mum, and he never found out who his father was, and it was that issue that caused him an awful lot of concern, and also an avid dislike of women in general. He was raised thinking that his grandmother was actually his mum, and he also believed, right the way up till pretty close to the end, that his mother was actually his sister. And he had a real difficult upbringing. He graduated from the University of Washington, and it was soon after that that this guy that was a favourite of the women started on a murder spree. He killed his first victim in Seattle back in 1966, and he tended to prey on attractive college students. He committed a whole range of murders across the Pacific Northwest. He went into Utah and Colorado, killing more and more women before being arrested. And despite being convicted of kidnapping, he actually managed to escape from a police station not once, but twice while he was waiting for a trial in Colorado. He moved down to Florida, where he killed several members of the universities down there, and his last victim, a 12-year-old little girl who he raped and murdered. Now, when he was finally apprehended, he was driving a stolen car a week after the last murder, and his trial became an absolute media sensation. And because he was on television so much right across America, once again, all of his lovelorn fans came out of the woodwork. Because this was the first murder trial ever to be fully televised. And it featured Ted Bundy right in front, bang in everyone's faces, acting as one of his own defense lawyers. Well, he became a media star overnight. He would have journalists coming to his cell, and he would tell them incredible stories about how nice he was and how he couldn't possibly kill. He got letters of admiration from women all over the world. And of course, as soon as he admitted that he was a murderer, even more letters came from even more women from across the planet. What he used to like doing, he played the media. He would give a clue about an additional murder that he just might have committed, but he wasn't going to commit himself. And all he was doing that whole time was trying to delay his own execution. But that didn't work. He was executed in the electric chair in 1989. The number of people that he killed to this day is completely unknown. So let's head briefly off to a country that I've been lucky enough to visit on a number of occasions, Norway. Now, you get this impression that Scandinavians are very, very laid back, and they are. They're a very, very peaceful race of people if you look across international history over the last 1,000 years. Except for one lady. A woman who would later be known as Lady Bluebeard. She actually immigrated to America from Norway back in 1881, and she ended up settling in the windy city of Chicago, where she ended up marrying a fellow Norwegian immigrant. The pair of them had 4 children, 2 tragically dying young in mysterious circumstances, and they ran a sweet shop, a big candy store. And by 1900, the store mysteriously burned down. And Gunnis's husband was dead, although both happened under, again, those mysterious and suspicious circumstances. And Lady Bluebeard, Guinness, was able to collect a whole range of insurance policies, and that gave her sufficient money to buy a farm. She chose the place where it would be to be Indiana, and she settled in a place called LaPorte, where she quickly married. And 8 months later, her second husband died. Now, Guinness claimed that he'd had a bad burn from scalding water, and while he was suffering from that scald, he'd walked into a heavy meat grinder, smashing his skull and dying on the spot. Now, it sounded a fairly far-fetched story, and they held an inquest, but they could find absolutely no proof of foul play. And that led to Guinness getting another huge insurance payout. So, she went into the local newspaper office and put an advert in the paper of the time in search of a third husband. And it said that the only thing she needed was the person who was going to be the suitor had to come and visit her on her own Indiana farm. Well, the thought of having a rich widow who owns a farm attracted several prospective suitors. The thing was, only one of them made it out alive, and he told the police that he remembers waking up after passing out to see Guinness looking sinister standing over him. He stood up, turned around and absolutely legged it. Now, nobody knows for certain how many people Belle Guinness murdered. However, karma, being what it is, what goes around indeed comes around, met a grisly end herself. In February 1908, there was another fire, this time completely devastating her beloved farm. And there, in the wreckage, they found the Guinness children, black, ashen, completely burned up, and the decapitated corpse of a woman. Now, officials identified the decapitated woman as Guinness, but doubt began to spread, because the body was much smaller than the tall, fairly heavy and quite booby Belle. The search for her missing head never turned up. This led to a discovery on the farm of almost a dozen bodies, including all of the missing suitors and several local children who disappeared over the years. Now, if you look at it from a police or investigative point of view, it couldn't have been Guinness, because there she was, dead, burnt beyond recognition and headless, if you believed it. So they had to look elsewhere. They had to try and find someone else who could have been responsible for these grisly crimes. And they turned to Ray Lamphere, a farmhand that used to work for Guinness. She'd fired him a few years earlier, and he was very, very bitter about it. And she had claimed to friends that Lamphere had threatened her life. So he was arrested and tried for his crimes, but was only convicted of arson, of burning down the farm, even though he swore that he didn't do it. So Belle Gunness's real fate remains in the stars, totally unknown. The thing was, over the next dozen or so years, there were various sightings of Belle Gunness. Everybody said it looked just like her, but she wasn't called Gunness anymore. It was always women with different names, and maybe that's how she got away with murder. Now, the joy of our Grisly Tales, it tells you things that you didn't know about usually fairly well-known and high-profile things. People, historical things, legends, myths, all of that. So how about a clown who became a mass murderer? I'm talking about a man called John Wayne Gacy, named after his and many other people's hero, the Duke, but to most of his neighbours in Chicago again, John Wayne Gacy was just a friendly bloke. He would hold block parties. Everybody would come out, have a few drinks, have a few laughs, and think, what a guy that John Wayne Gacy is. He would also volunteer to help the local Democratic politician, and he would go out delivering leaflets or knocking on doors and trying to get people to come out and vote for him. And he was also well known locally as the guy who would dress up as a clown at local children's birthday parties. Now, little did the people on that block in Chicago know, but Gacy had already been to prison for sexually assaulting a teenage boy. And yet, he was there, hiding in plain sight, a horrible secret. And if his neighbours had have known, he would never have been able to get away with what he eventually did. In 1978, not that long ago, when a 15-year-old boy who had last been seen with Gacy, whose construction business this teenager was applying for a job at, the young lad went missing, and when he did, the police got a search warrant for John Wayne Gacy's house because he was the last person to see the lad alive. There, they found a class ring and some young men's clothing actually, belonging to a whole host of different men who had previously been reported missing. They also discovered hidden beneath the house a crawl space. It was 4 feet deep, and there was a really strong smell coming from under the rug. When they lifted the rug and found the crawl space, they were shocked to find the decomposing bodies of 29 boys and teenagers that Gacy had raped and murdered. Gacy's ex-wife, while she lived there, complained about this horrible smell the house had for years. And Gacy had said, "Oh, we've just got mildew. It's moisture in the walls. We can't get rid of that." Now, the police at the time also came under criticism because the family members of countless victims had said Gacy was a possible suspect because they all knew Gacy. Why hadn't they come to him before? Once he was arrested, he didn't hang about. He admitted to killing several additional men, more than the 29 that he had dumped in his crawl space. He also said he disposed of their bodies in a nearby lake. Later on, one of his cellmates claimed that Gacy had told him that he slit open their stomachs and put huge rocks inside their rib cage to sink the bodies so they would never bloat and float up to the surface. He asked his counsel to put forward an insanity defense and an insanity appeal, and neither worked. He was convicted on 33 counts of murder, and he was executed by lethal injection in 1994. Deservedly so. So let us dig even deeper and look at something else that happened in many people's lifetimes. Imagine being an older person, grey beard, grey tash, grey hair, coming close to the end of your profession, and you could manage to squeeze in up to 250 murders before you were finished to earn yourself the name Dr. Death. And yet that is exactly the story of Dr. Harold Shipman, one of history's deadliest serial killers. Yet he was a married family man and worked as a doctor, a GP, a popular British doctor. He began killing back in 1972. Now it's thought that he killed at least 71 patients while he was working at his first practice, and the people that went to see him thought he was great, thought he was their favourite doctor. At his second practice, he killed almost double that amount. He joined the second practice after upsetting pretty much all of the other doctors that worked there. They found him arrogant. They said he was brusque, overconfident, a bit too cocksure of himself. Finally, in 1998, a local undertaker and another doctor noticed an unusually high number of cremation certificates that were signed Dr. Harold Shipman. They also noticed a lot of similarities in the recently dead patients themselves. They were nearly all elderly women. They were all found sitting up and fully clothed, not in bed as you would imagine would usually be the case with gravely ill senior citizens. Despite those clues, the initial investigation wasn't handled well, and this gave Harold Shipman a chance to kill at least 3 more times. But he ran out of luck later the same year when the daughter of his final victim, who happened to be a lawyer called Kathleen Grundy, decided to claim that he'd not only killed her mother, but he'd also tried to create a new fake will, naming him as her sole beneficiary. Now this, had it have gone through, even though it was a scam, could have provided him with enough money to let him retire, as if he didn't have enough money, he was a rich doctor, but give him enough money to leave the country and escape justice forever. Unlike his earlier victims, Grundy, the elderly Lady Grundy, had not been cremated, and an autopsy revealed lethally high levels of diamorphine, the drug that Shipman used for most, if not all, of his killings. And he was formally charged with 15 murders, and he was convicted and sentenced to life without parole in 2000. Shipman died in prison in 2004, committing suicide in his cell. He never admitted to any of the killings. There's been conspiracy theories about many things, and yet some doctors have come forward, not wishing to be named for obvious reasons, to say that Shipman was not a murderer. He was a mercy killer, taking the lives of people who were in pain, taking them out of that pain by upping the levels of diamorphine. And that is the passage, it's the pathway that doctors claim should be adopted when there's no treatment that can help patients recover. They're put on the pathway, it's called, and they end up taking the lives of their patients. Many doctors and nurses believe this happens to this day, with many doctors wishing to ease the burden on families of patients who are in long-term pain. We could talk about that all day, but I've got one more story to tell. And once again, it's about a name that you will probably recognize: Jeffrey Dahmer. He committed his first murder in 1978. He was just an 18-year-old kid, and he would continue killing right the way up until his arrest in 1991. And this only came about because a fella escaped his clutches and managed to hail down a police car passing by him in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And when the victim took the police back to Dahmer's apartment, they began a full-on search. And during that search, they found a whole host of photographs of dismembered bodies, often bodies featuring the heads of people that they were looking for and had been looking for some time. Then they found severed heads. In containers, they found the penis and testicles of several other men, and also a huge tub filled with acid that Jeffrey Dahmer had used to dispose of some of the 17 people unlucky enough to be his victims. He'd had an awful life, really. Dahmer dropped out of college, dropped out of the army. He'd lived with various members of his family before being kicked out by all of them, including his beloved grandmother, which led him to settle in the Milwaukee apartment. A few years before his arrest in 91, with a lot of murders under his belt, Dahmer was convicted of drugging and sexually molesting a young teenager. But he only served a year, and he was released and continued to kill and like it. And he focused almost entirely on young men of colour. Dahmer's sensational trial, and it gave horrific descriptions of him eating the body parts of some of his victims. He also admitted that when they were dead, he would have sex with their bodies, and this renewed the entire world's interest in serial killers, and the books about them rocketed. But in 1992, he was sentenced to 957 years in jail. But karma's a bitch at times, and he was killed savagely by a fellow inmate just 2 years later. It's fascinating to look at these incredible stories. We got some more myths and legends to come. But if TV shows and forensic dramas have given us any kind of insight at all, it's that serial killers are a breed apart from other human beings. They're monsters that hide in the shadows. They prey on otherwise peaceful folk. The predators that they are always seem to lurk beyond the clutches of the police. So what does it take to bring down a creature like that? Sometimes it's a hero, a clever police officer or a detective, or maybe even a clever victim who saves the day, like the one that brought down Jeffrey Dahmer. After Tracy Edwards was taken to Dahmer's house and handcuffed, he pretended to befriend him, even though Dahmer was about to eat him. And when Dahmer thought this guy was going to be his friend, it gave him a false sense of security, and he managed to flee the house and wave down a police car. In other cases, a talented FBI profiler was responsible for the arrest of the butcher baker of Alaska, Robert Hansen, who hunted his victims through the woods with a knife and a gun. And it was a special agent called Roy Hazelwood. He told his colleagues to look out for an experienced big game hunter with low self-esteem and a stutter, and they all pointed directly to Hansen's door. Other times, no amount of courage or however clever you are would save the day. It's just dumb luck. And that was the case with a serial killer called Randy Kraft. Now, he'd been suspected by the police, but he was released due to a lack of evidence. And he was finally caught when he was pulled over for drunk driving, with the body of a dead man in his car. Then there was Larry Ayler. He was a house painter with a real bad temper who was serving a life sentence for murdering a 15-year-old Daniel Bridges. And yet it was only after he died that his lawyer released a list of 17 other people that he'd killed. Unknown victims who'd been buried in graves and they were never found. Anyway, we have many more grisly tales to tell, and if you can, make sure you pop across to robsonsworld.com. If you want to support the podcast and, of course, the website itself, there is a donation button there. It would be lovely if you could help us out in any which way you can. However, we've got some more corking tales for you. Now we're going to be travelling a little bit further north to another place that you've all heard of and only the luckiest have ever been. Loch Ness. Now, you may be expecting some monstrous story, and this is a true one, set during World War II, and it's Loch Ness's World War II curse. If you are lucky enough to stare across the amazing valley that houses Loch Ness as the sun bleaches everything in sight, it would be very easy to think that you are in Switzerland, or maybe even the French Alps. Yet when the weather turns bad with winds of up to 200 miles an hour with freezing sleet and snow, you can also easily think that hell has paid you a visit. For years, there really was a slumbering beast just waiting to be found, lying there unnoticed in a quiet backwater of the loch. High up in the clouds, a plane had been struggling to battle through thick snow, its landing gear freezing up, and the captain knew that something terrible was about to happen. Now, when this Wellington bomber took off, the snow was already packed solid on the ground, yet still they were determined to take part in a routine training mission. As they sailed up into the air, they felt sure that the mild sprinkling of snow was certainly not going to hold them back. Yet on trying to return to the airbase, the captain knew there were a number of things seriously wrong. First of all, one of the engines had failed. The plane was losing both height and speed, and the torrential blizzard was making instruments freeze, and the aircraft had no real idea where it was. Now, the captain knew that the plane was going down, so he ordered his men to bail out. The gunner was the first to leap out, and the others gazed in shock as his parachute just didn't open, so he fell and fell and fell, finally smashing himself into the rocky crag and an instant death. 6 others landed safely in whiteout conditions, and no one really sure whereabouts they were. Now, the pilot and co-pilot stayed on board. They were desperate not to let a plane called Arthur Robert to be lost, especially as Britain was so short of aircraft to face the Germans. This plane already had a great reputation. It was the veteran of 14 bombing raids across Germany, so the pilot needed to do everything he possibly could to save her. Now, with the clouds so dense and filled with snow, it was impossible to see where they were going, when, just for a split second, there was an ounce of clarity, and there before them was the long-stretching Loch Ness. The captain miraculously brought the plane down gently on the loch, and before the plane sank, both pilots were able to get out a dinghy and paddle across safely to the shore. As they paddled, the plane began to sink down into the 250 feet of water, and for almost 40 years it remained an ornament gracing Nessie's front room. It wasn't until 1976 that a group of American marine biologists found it wedged deeply into the bed of the loch. Finally, it had been recovered. R for Robert was the very last of 11,461 Wellingtons. So a charitable trust began collecting money to try and recover it from the grimy, peat-soaked waters of Loch Ness. Now, the poor broken body of Sergeant John Stanley Fensom, the rear gunner, was found nearby, long dead. Then he would later be interred at the Holy Trinity Church in Biscot Churchyard in Luton. But a lot of people believe his spirit remains at Loch Ness. There have been thousands of sightings across the surface of the loch when the mist pours across the water. There's often a tall, dark shape moving over the surface. Some swear that it's the big, long neck of the beastie. Yet others swear that it's actually the walking body of the gunner returning to where his life suddenly ended. No one knows how that parachute never opened. Yet locals know that the loch is cursed. On one occasion, a cousin of Sergeant Fensom visited the loch and claimed to have heard a man calling out through the fog. In 1975, Joseph Murray of Aberdeen hired a boat to fish the loch when a fierce mist rolled across the water and sat all around him and the boat. His story chilled everyone. He said, "It was like being snug in one huge pillow all around me, and yet 3 impossible things happened. I do not create stories. I am an honest man and tell you all straight. First, as clear as day, I saw a man wearing a brown jacket with fur on the collar walk by the boat, across the surface of the water. I saw him so clearly. I called out and shouted for him to join me in the boat. About 2 minutes later, there was a huge hammering sound on the side of the boat, physically moving the boat about 2 yards to one side. Then, just as I decided to row back to shore, using my compass to guide me to the correct shore, just as I started rowing, I could see the lights of the town ahead of me, so pointed the prow of the rowing boat that way. As I reached the shore, I looked across at the loch and saw this airman walking across the water. I could make out the grey uniform. I saw his insignia, later identified as that of a rear gunner, and the kit he carried like an open face mask. I shouted at him, and he seemed not to hear me until I shouted, "Sergeant!" rather loudly, and the figure stopped. He turned towards me and actually gave me a wave. Could it be that after all of the speculation that the Loch Ness Monster exists in the lake as this prehistoric plesiosaur or whatever, maybe the Loch Ness Monster is in fact a simple ghost gliding across the surface of the lake that would claim his aircraft? Is it his curse that infests the place, adding its weight to that of the Satanist Aleister Crowley, who also, of course, lived on the Loch Ness lochside? Now, on robsonsworld.com, there's a whole host of 3 and 4 hour adventures all over the world where we've got up to all kinds of jolly jackanapes and some particularly frightening things. But I'm taking you fairly close at hand to a village just off the A1 called Belford. Now, a beautiful family hotel in Belford with fabulous food, the Blue Bell, has become a bit of a dream wedding venue too, and yet there's also an old legend from its earliest times when it was simply called the Bell. Then it was called the Bonnie Bell, and eventually the Blue Bell as it is today. It was built on the site of an old peel tower that was destroyed by the Scottish. The tower had a bell to warn locals of impending trouble, so everyone in that area knew that was the Bell. Like so many places around the world, there's numerous stories of death and destruction there, including the entire massacre of the whole village. The original village were massacred. The nearest other peel tower of the time was Spindleston Ducat Mill, and that was originally a warning tower in the 1700s, later used as a mill, a windmill, and then a dovecote. Now, long before that, many from the village helped pirates land booty up and down the coast, including back in 1272, Walter de Huntercombe, the lord of the manor. It seems he paid his debts from filthy lucre shared with local pirates. It seems that his lordship got a kick out of doing daring things, and on one occasion he'd even sailed aboard a pirate ship and robbed a Spanish craft, taking all of their valuable merchandise and landing it on Holy Island. The church bought much of it at a special rate. Many of the furnishings were direct from the Spanish court. Yes, sin is sin, but business is business. In around 1788, the coaching inn, the Bonnie Bell, was a very, very busy place. It needed staff almost all of the time, having grown from 8 rooms up to 20. When a family arrived with a personal servant, an 18-year-old beauty called Hilda Somerville, originally from Leeds. The family treated her appallingly, and during their overnight stay had even beaten her in full view of the inn's staff. They had a lovely room, but ordered her to sleep in the coach. The manager was a decent chap called William Wood, intervened and gave the young girl a staff bedroom for the night. And when she awoke the next morning, Wood decided to offer her a job to save her from future abuse. Hilda, known better as Hildy, was happy to accept and was very swift to resign. Her ex-employees didn't take that very well. They threatened no manner of things. Wood, a quiet man, faced them though, saying, "Away with all your wind and piss. The lass works for me now, so off you go." Now, as they were well and truly paid off, they refused to pay, telling the landlord that they'd given her family money to buy her services. But that had been 3 years earlier, and she'd more than paid off the debt. So, from that day on, the Bonnie Bell had the loyalest member of staff it would ever have. And not long afterwards, Wood, the landlord, fell for the girl, and they were about to be married. The banns were read, the date was set, and it would be held in the 12th century St. Mary's Church, and all were welcome. Well, that was except for Agnes Allen, a lady who lived in what is now Belford Mains, yet back then it was just Belford Moor. For 3 years, she and Wood sort of had a kind of understanding of sorts. Now, although he had never asked for her hand in marriage, they had dallied, and locally she'd made it known she was to marry the innkeeper. Now, she would try to stop them, but Wood firmly rejected any proposal from her to switch brides. Yet the Allen family had even applied to the courts to stop the function, so the wedding day arrives and the bride didn't. Wood was left standing at the church with his best man, utterly destroyed that his beloved Hildy had betrayed him. And yet, the poor girl was never seen again. Yet to the shock and horror of the congregation, at the church, Agnes, in a beautiful white wedding gown, walked forward and offered her hand instead. Wood barked some blasphemy at her and raced back to the inn to try and find the woman he truly loved. There, next to a stable yard, was a pool of blood and a spatter across the wall. Still, no sign of a body. He knew it had been Agnes. He searched for Hildy's body for months without any success, and then finally, the room they shared together, he bricked it up. No one else could ever be happy in there again. 4 months later, Agnes was found drowned in Belford Burn. There was a duck egg-sized lump on her brow. Locals believed she tripped, maybe hit her head on a stone, knocking herself out face down in the burn. Yet those who had been in that church that day when Agnes had shown herself knew Wood had revenged his bride-to-be. Now, coincidentally, Agnes Allen was related to William Wilson Allen, who was raised in Belford Moor, before joining the forces and getting a Victoria Cross at Rorke's Drift. Now, over the years, customers began to experience odd occurrences, usually in the night, someone sitting on their bed, noises, grey and black wispy shapes, and commonly a maid walking through the wall. In later years, a more recent landlord discovered the blocked up doorway, reopening it as a staff room, and this seemed to end Hildy's late night walks. However, after pub refurbishments in the 1980s, Hildy was back with a vengeance. One housekeeper found herself showered in glass light bulbs. On another occasion, this black maid-shaped figure threw ornaments, glasses and books at 3 visitors trying to get a room. Now, we did a ghost hunt at the Blue Bell in Belford, and that, along with a lot of other ghostly and grisly adventures, can be heard on robsonsworld.com if you fancy popping there and having a look. It would help us if you did. Going to finish off tonight's Grisly Tales with the Bleeding Nun of Galway. Now, to this day in Galway, young people are warned to avoid an area that's known as the Long Walk, especially the area near Wolftone Bridge. Now, this is all about ancient legends about the White Lady, who would later be known as the Bleeding Nun. Now, they tell young people especially to stay away, and that of course guarantees that they all go and have a look, yet many suffer a fright like they've never known in their lives. Few people would ever dare go down there after dark, because this apparition has an attitude, and it's been known to make people bleed. So what's the story? Well, it's a common one these days, sadly, ultimately of abuse in the church, but in this case way back in the 1580s. Fort Hill Cemetery had a small chapel attached to it, where a priest and 2 nuns and 2 training nuns looked after the needs of the local people. Now, back then, Ireland hated England and supported Spain in their attempt to conquer all of Britannia. Inside its main gate is a tribute and memorial to the Spanish sailors of the Armada defeated by Drake, the adverse weather blowing their vessels all the way from the Channel to smash on the rocky coast of Galway. Yet, Father Burke was an older man, yet he always had a love of young children. Sadly and frighteningly, the younger the better. He ran special services just for the little ones, and even in those days, he had a dubious reputation. Some young children, especially young girls, had been frightened by him and refused to attend. The 2 older nuns, many believe, had suffered at his hands in earlier years, but were now quite old and beyond his lascivious interests. Sadly, the 2 younger nuns, Sister Teresa and Sister Margaret, both in their mid-teens, were at the precise age the priest was known to be attracted to. The older nuns watched as the behaviour of Sister Teresa changed. She became more insular, quieter, wanted more baths and more time on her own. They knew that Father Burke had raped her. They counselled her as best as they could, but she would never be the same again, and nor had they been. Sister Teresa told them that they must warn Sister Margaret and tell the parents that their children were at risk. Now, despite being abuse victims themselves, the old father had their loyalty, and they told him of Sister Teresa's outburst. And that night she was found dead in her room, a sparse cell behind the chapel. During the night, Father Burke had come to her, used her, and afterwards strangled the life from her poor battered body. The priest merely labelled it God's will, saying that she'd always been a weak girl. Sister Margaret did ask how did her face get so scratched and neck bruised, and on pulling back the blankets saw signs of sexual contact, totally prohibited by the church. Margaret said, "We must send for soldiers. Some man has taken her, and she fought back and he's killed her." Father Burke said, "Don't embarrass the church girl. If she had a boyfriend and sneaked him in, then she is responsible for this. Let us keep it to ourselves rather than humiliate this child who knew no better The church is more important than one errant soul. The older nuns had heard this pontificating many times from the hypocritical old priest, yet they both felt jealous that these younger waifs had taken his attention. Before joining the sisterhood, Margaret had worked on her father's farm. She may have been very slim, but she was strong. She'd carried hay bales, tended oxen and bulls, and built stone walls around fields. She was far more than an uneducated, naive girl. So a month later, she was bathing in a large tin bath in her cell with barely 5 inches of water in it. And that was rather lukewarm. She was naked and using the rough soap to clean her entire body as best she could when Father Burke just walked in. In a low, frightening voice he said, "My child, tonight you shall enjoy the glory of your faith. I shall place the love of our Lord God directly inside you." He went on to say how great an honour this would be, and that it was only with such a holy man that she could get this close to the God she loved. He pulled her to him, casting off her towel. Her body was wet, and as he grasped at her arm, she managed to slip away, racing to the corner of her cell. It was the girth of a heavy brass candlestick that Margaret picked up and smashed it across the priest's head, shattering his skull and spilling his brains across the concrete floor. The 2 nuns heard the furore and raced in. "What happened?" screamed one. "Father Burke is dead." Margaret said it was obviously God's will, throwing back his remark from Sister Teresa's demise. There was no enquiry. He was buried quietly, with many locals staying away because they knew of his penchant for young children. He was replaced by Father McKee, who was a close friend of Father Burke. The nuns briefed him as to the kind of person Sister Margaret was and what she'd done to the old priest. The priest contacted a few other brothers to get rid of the young woman. Back then there was no sending her to a new congregation. If there was a problem or a non-believer, you dealt with them. Many priests of the time bragged about the number of Jews, heretics and non-believers they had dispatched, so one young girl would be no trouble. One Saturday, young Sister Margaret, barely 16, known for a heavy black animal fur she wrapped around herself, she was making her way along this long walk in Galway, having visited some ill children and an elderly woman close to death. It was a cold, breezy February night. It felt too cold for snow. Margaret was wrapped in that black animal skin given to her by her father, the farmer. It was a long-skinned hide and could pretty much withstand any weather that old Ireland could hurl at it. When suddenly she was bundled over by 2 men hurling themselves on her. Father McKee said, "Take no chances, the witch killed Father Burke." They held her tightly while the older brothers wondered what McKee had planned. To take the life of a holy father is a sin, only capable by a heretic, not anyone with a love for God. Margaret laughed in their faces, saying, "I suppose his God loved him for raping all of the children and murdering a nun." Her face was slapped, yet she showed no fear. Instead, the 2 men holding her suddenly let go. They felt some kind of electric shock. Sister Margaret stood before these men, each one determined that she would die that very night. One had a rope saying, "Let's hang the bitch and get it done with." They hurled the rope over a tree. It failed to catch over a bough no matter how many times it was thrown. Sister Margaret laughed again. "It's God's will, and know this, each one of you will die tonight." She stood there and held out her hands, and suddenly a number of men grabbed at their own brows as a migraine headache came upon them. Others had nosebleeds, yet could not understand how the young girl who had never touched them had done this. McKee raced towards her, wiping blood from his own nose, and on getting close, the nun was bleeding too. Her hands showed signs of stigmata, her brow was cut as if she had worn a crown of thorns, and her eyes were blood red, running crimson streams down her cheeks. She threw off her heavy animal skin as a sword was pushed through her stomach. It made no difference. She stood there grinning at her attackers. "Is that really the best you can do?" The priests ran at her and were swatted. The first fell, his neck obviously broken. Another fell onto the stony ground, smashing his head open. Their numbers were dwindling when she started chanting a passage from the Bible, including "Suffer little children." And at that, McKee's head began to throb. Then he had some kind of heart attack, his eyes bulging out, literally popping out, hanging limply down his cheeks as he grasped his chest and begged for help. "Your victims don't get help, and nor shall you." The nun walked over to him, placing her heel on his windpipe until he was dead. The remaining brothers tried to grasp her, but some kind of force seemed to hold them back. Another threw a rock that hit her full in the face, breaking her nose and making it explode with blood, and once again she laughed. There was not an inch of her skin showing that was not deep in her own blood. She went around to each priest, shattering their skulls with rocks until there was one left standing. She was badly wounded. The sword blow was far worse than she thought. She knew she was slowly bleeding to death. By then the two nuns had arrived, hoping to watch her execution. Instead saw her almost hover above the dead priests. She pointed at the two old sisters. "If you left a servant of God hurt children again, I shall return from heaven or hell, and your lives will be mine." As she said it, their faces contorted in the strong wind. Some say she walked to the dock where the tide was fully in and dove into the turbulent water, never to be seen again. Others say that she exploded into pieces as she fell. The bleeding nun was gone, and a kind of justice had been done. Now, we say that there's always an ounce of truth in these myths and legends. And over the centuries, hundreds have seen a glowing figure of a nun along the Long Walk. In 1923, a couple taking the evening air saw a woman in a fur animal hide wrap. As she turned around, her face was covered in blood. They turned to run just in time to see it disappear. In the 1960s, an elderly townsman saw a nun walking home at midnight. She reached out her hand and it was bleeding. As he looked up at her face, she had long red bloody tears from eyes without a hint of white. He said, "Look, come with me, I'll help you," just as she turned into an ashen mist and was blown away by the wind. A Galway photographer, Jonathan Curran, took a few pictures of the Long Walk 3 days after we had visited that very spot. And one of these pictures clearly shows a woman with a black animal hide wrap around her body. Perhaps the first ever clear picture of the Bleeding Nun of Galway. And that is the end of our Grisly Tales. I hope you've enjoyed them. Any help you could give us, we'd be very, very much obliged. robsonsworld.com if you can, in any shape or form. And I know how difficult it is at present, as it is for us too. We will try to continue with our thanks. Stay well, and until next time, God bless you, and I wish you well.